Whenever a contract is breached, there will be a remedy, and the most common remedy at contract law is expectation damages. And the most essential part of expectation damages are direct expectation damages. And the most common method of calculating direct expectation damages is the loss in value method. This video will teach you how to derive the loss in value formula and to apply the loss in value equation in measuring direct expectation damages, which is a critical step in calculating damages in general. In general, contract promises must be kept. So when a obligor, meaning a person who has an obligation, hence obligor, breaches, fails to perform that obligation under a contract, the obligee, the person who is to receive the benefit of that promise, is entitled to a remedy. Which remedy? We're going to find out. This chart behind me shows all of the available remedies at contract law. We're going to focus in this video, however, on money damages, specifically on the most common form of money damages, expectation damages, which seek to put a party in the position it would have been in had the contract been fully performed. And in particular today, in this one lesson, we're going to focus even further on calculating direct damages. This is often the trickiest part of understanding money damages in general, and money damages is the most common remedy at contract law, so it's quite important to know this information. Direct damages can be calculated in three different ways: loss in value, also known as diminution in value, cost of completing performance, and loss in volume. The most common by far and the one preferred is loss in value. So once again, that's what we'll be focusing on here. We're going to spend the rest of the time in this video understanding how to calculate loss in value as a measure of direct damages, which is one of the three components in addition to incidental damages and consequential damages that make up expectation damages, which in turn, expectation damages is the most common form of money damages, which is the most common contractual remedy at law. So let's dive in and learn how to calculate loss in value as a measure of direct damages, and we'll do that from the basis of understanding the purpose of contracts as a way to increase one's value, and that will help us understand how to determine what was expected and compare it to what was actually received, thus calculating loss in value as a measure of direct damages. There are three methods of calculating direct damage or direct loss, and we're going to start with the most common, which is the loss in value calculation, which is going to be the difference between what the party expected to receive and what the party actually received. The difference or diminution in value between expectations and reality, which again is sort of the cornerstone of expectation damages. And then we're going to take a look at some alternatives. But first, let's step through what it means to have a loss in value. To understand the concept of how a court should look at direct expectation damages, through the loss in value or diminution in value method, let's look at a simple formula that describes the value of a contract from the perspective of a seller who is suing because a buyer breached its agreement to buy some good or some service from the seller. Under this contract, the seller is intending to sell some good or service for a price. That's what sellers do. They're not giving their stuff away, they're selling for a price, for some amount, usually of money in most cases. And that we're going to call the contract price. It's the price the buyer will pay. That's how much it's being sold for, is how much the buyer, two sides of one coin. So we first have this concept that the buyer is going to pay some type of contract price. Why do sellers sell things? Well, they sell it to make a profit. That's generally the assumption, is that parties are entering into commerce in order to better themselves financially, economically. So under a contract, a seller sells some good or service for a contract price and expects to get some type of value from doing this deal, that they're going to end up better off. Now, sellers also expect to incur some amount of costs. I mean, producing goods costs some money. Performing services at least has an opportunity cost. You could be doing something else instead of working, or instead of working for this person, you could be working for that person with that time. So in any event, there is some cost incurred with performing, and a seller who is wise, at least, is intending to make some profit. So in addition to their cost, they're expecting to earn some profit. And so we have this very simple equation, fundamental equation in understanding the seller's perspective, that the price the buyer pays is equal to some amount that the seller has to expend. They know they're going to incur some cost, and the rest, the surplus, also known as, yes, you guessed it, the seller's surplus, is the seller's profit, the amount the seller expects to be better off because of the deal. Let's simplify this formula a little bit to make it easier to read. A simple formula that describes the value of a contract is price, buyer's price in this case, equals cost, seller's cost in this case, plus profit, seller's profit. So price equals cost plus profit. Let me give you a simple example, and we're going to use this example for a little bit here. Let's say we have a Ford dealership, and Ford dealerships are sellers of, Ford cars. And so you go to a Ford dealership and you agree to purchase a Ford Escape for $30,000. The dealer will need to purchase that car from Ford to sell it to you. It's a middleman. It's going to be a distributor. So it will incur some costs in obtaining that car. It'll also incur some costs in transferring the car. And this all reflects the dealer's costs of engaging in this sale. Now, they're not doing this as a charity. They're car dealerships sell cars to make money, and so they're expecting to sell this for some cost and for some profit. So if the dealer gets this car from Ford and they pay $25,000 to Ford for the car, that's $25,000 in cost, and then they pay $1,000 to ship it on a flatbed, that's now $26,000 in cost, plus $1,000 for various types of transfer paperwork. That's $27,000 in costs. The price is $30,000, and therefore, it's an equation, has to balance. The dealer's profit is $3,000. If you breach the contract by not buying the car, there is, in this case, some cost avoided by the dealer. So let's next split costs, seller's costs, into two types of costs. Costs that have been avoided, that the seller didn't have to pay because of the breach, and costs incurred. If the car is already paid for and shipped, they already sent the money to Ford and paid for the trucking company to ship it out, the cost incurred is $26,000, $25,000 to purchase the car, and $1,000 to ship it. But the dealer avoided the $1,000 in costs to do the transfer paperwork. That didn't happen because the car wasn't transferred. So it's important to distinguish costs avoided and costs incurred for reasons we'll see in just a minute. Remember, the dealer's profit comes from you, the buyer, and we can now make our formula a little more specific by recognizing that sometimes the buyer has partly performed by paying down some of the contract price, making a down payment. Therefore, we should split out the contract price, the buyer's contract price, to account for this situation. So let's split out the buyer's contract price into price paid and price unpaid. So if you made a down payment, say of 10% on $30,000, that's $3,000. That would be $3,000 in price paid and $27,000 in price unpaid. All right, next, let's rearrange this formula. We're going to make it a little bit more useful, and hopefully you can see where I'm going with this. So if we remember our algebra, we can rearrange this formula, and we can arrive at price unpaid minus cost avoided equals cost incurred plus profit minus price paid. So that's our new equation here. And what exactly does this tell us about expectations? So pause here, take a minute and think about this one. We have an equation that we've derived that we know has to equal the contract price that's not yet paid minus the cost that the seller has not yet incurred equals the cost that the seller has incurred plus the seller's profit minus the price that has been paid. And what we're trying to do is get the seller to experience the profit that was expected, right? So, how can we think through this? Well, the cost incurred was going to be incurred anyway. That's water under the bridge, so to speak. That's like the pain that you go through when you have surgery. That's expected as part of the deal. The price likewise was already paid, right? That down payment has already been issued. If you strip away these values, you're left with, on the right side of the equation, only profit. So how do we give the seller the expected profit? We give the seller the price unpaid minus the cost avoided. And that's going to give us the seller's expectation damages. The seller's expectation damages are going to be the price that has not yet been paid minus the cost avoided. So in this case of the car dealership, what are the seller's damages? The price unpaid is $27,000, and the cost avoided at first appears to be just $1,000, the transfer paperwork. So, geez, you owe the Ford dealership $26,000? Well, not so fast. That ignores a key fact. The Ford dealership has a brand new Ford Escape on its property, on its lot, that it can now resell. In fact, the Ford dealership has a duty to make reasonable efforts to mitigate damages by selling that car and avoiding those damages. It has an obligation to avoid more costs by actually selling that car. If the Ford dealership does in fact sell the car to someone else for $30,000, now how much is the dealer's loss in value? Well, under this scenario, the dealership has avoided all of its cost because it actually sold the car for the full price that it expected. It got the $3,000 profit that it was planning, and it has your $3,000. Under this scenario, the Ford dealership is actually better off, not worse off because of the breach. The dealership has your $3,000 deposit, and it made $3,000 profit on the sale. So under that calculation, the Ford dealership gets nothing for the breach. And we'll see in a minute that you might be able to collect your $3,000 in restitution. But we'll save that for the end. Now wait a minute. This result that the Ford dealership gets nothing if you breach doesn't seem entirely fair either. The Ford salesman took the time and effort to try to sell you a car, and you breached your agreement, and now there's no damages? That seems off. If the Ford dealership had sold that car to you, it still could have sold another car to someone else. And this means the Ford dealership's in a unique situation where it was able to sell more volume, and the expectation to the Ford dealership was not to sell this car, but rather, in that scenario, to sell two cars. The seller lost volume or quantity because of your breach, and we'll address that later when we talk about the alternative method of calculating direct damages as lost volume damages. All right, so that was a bit of a long time to have a slide up there. Again, feel free to skip around using the links below, but you may want to pull back and look at this if that didn't quite click, because if you get this formula, you'll be able to derive, and not just memorize, but derive and know how to calculate expectation damages from the seller's perspective. Let's next look at the value of a contract from the perspective of a buyer who is suing because the seller breached its promise to sell some good or failed to provide some service to the buyer. Let's go back to that simple value of that simple formula of contract value, which is going to be price equals cost plus profit. Remember that from the last slide. Price equal plus cost plus profit. So how does that translate into the buyer's side of things? How does the buyer of a product see this? What does it even mean for the buyer to have some profit? Well, just like the seller, who only entered into this contract because of the expectation of becoming better off for doing this contract, it's a bargain for exchange, or it lacks consideration, as you may remember from contract formation lessons. So both parties are expecting to get something out of this deal. They're expecting to become better off for it. And that amount better off, we're going to loosely refer to as profit. The buyer's profit, so to speak, is the surplus or extra value the buyer expects to have after the contract is performed. That is, the value of the seller's performance must be, in the buyer's eyes, above and beyond what the buyer pays. The buyer must, by definition, value the seller's performance more than the cost of that performance, more than the contract price. And that difference, that amount that the buyer values the performance more than the amount that it's paying for that performance, is the surplus or the profit or the value that the buyer is going to see. In economic terms, the buyer's surplus from the transaction. All right, let me once again simplify this, and let's rewrite it as performance, meaning seller's performance, equals price, meaning the contract price, plus profit, or as I mentioned, the buyer's surplus or value from the transaction. So what happens if the seller does not perform? This is easier to see if we split things up again. First, let's split the price into price paid on the one hand. So that's like a down payment, like that 10% for the car, and the price unpaid, the amount the buyer has yet to pay to the seller, such as a final payment only due upon completion. We can also split out the right side of the equation, performance, to account for the fact the seller may have partly performed. And let's call this performance complete and performance incomplete, or complete performance and incomplete performance. The performance that's complete, well, that's valuable to the buyer, that's been rendered, and that doesn't have to be done anymore, whatever that service is. So you hired someone to paint your house, and they painted one room out of 5 rooms. Well, that room is done, and you get to enjoy the fresh paint in that room. That's the performance complete. The other 5 rooms that have not been painted, that's the performance incomplete. So if we remember our basic algebra, we can once again rearrange this equation to make a little bit more immediate sense. We'll subtract the price unpaid from both sides and subtract the performance complete from both sides to arrive at the formula performance incomplete minus price unpaid equals price paid plus profit minus performance complete. Once again, note that the price that was paid is, well, paid. That's money transferred, that's water under the bridge. And the performance complete, that's the room that's been painted, it's going to stay painted. It's done, it's gone. What is left that reflects what the buyer's expectations are that have not been performed? What is the remainder that's going to get us to the buyer's profit that hasn't occurred? Well, that's the left side of the equation. The performance that's incomplete hasn't happened. The price unpaid hasn't happened. Everything else has happened except the profit. So in order to give the buyer the profit, in order to give the buyer the expectation under the contract, we're going to have to deliver to the buyer, to pay to the buyer, the seller will pay to the buyer the value of the incomplete performance minus any cost avoided, any price unpaid by the buyer. And so we now have a nice formula for the buyer's expectation damages, which is substitute performance, which is another way of saying the value of the incomplete performance. How much will it cost to complete that performance, right? How much do we have to pay somebody else to come in and paint those other 4 rooms? That's the amount of performance that's incomplete, easy to value by having someone do that work or appraise that work, and subtract out the amount of money that wasn't paid, the other thing that hasn't happened, the price unpaid, and that gets us the expectation value for the buyer. And as I mentioned, it's probably easiest to think about incomplete performance, performance incomplete, as the value of substitute performance, the cost of substitute performance. How much will it cost for someone else to finish the breaching seller's job? And that is a measure of incomplete performance. Of course, the price unpaid, often easier to calculate. Therefore, the measure of direct expectation damages for seller's breach, meaning the buyer's direct expectation damages, is measured by the cost of substitute performance by another seller minus the price as yet unpaid by the buyer. Let's take a look at 3 examples, and hopefully that'll help you see how calculating direct expectation damages works in practice. First example, very simple. I call this one the printer paper. Dwayne owns a small business and he agrees to purchase 100 reams of printer paper from Dunder Mifflin for $10 per ream, which would be $1,000 total. Although the contract is in writing, Dunder Mifflin fails to ship the paper, so it's clearly a breach of contract. Dwayne then goes to his local Office Depot and purchases the paper for $12 per ream for a total of $1,200. What is the measure of expectation damages? Well, the formula is we're going to look at the cost of substitute performance, or the cost to complete the performance, minus whatever price has not yet been paid, the cost that was avoided, and that will equal the price paid plus the expected profit minus the performance that was completed, as we saw from our previous formula. So how does that look in practice here? Quite simple. The price for the substitute performance, the amount that was actually paid to complete the contract for achieving the paper, was $1,200. The original contract was for $1,000, but note that Dwayne saved that money. He didn't have to pay Dunder Mifflin since they didn't ship the paper. So he saved $1,000 but spent $1,200. And that shows that he was expecting to be $200 better off had he had this contract fulfilled through Dunder Mifflin. And in this simple example, since there was no prepayment and there was no performance by the breaching party, the amount of profit equals the amount of damages, and it's very simple. We look at the left side of the equation. We have $200 in expectation damages in this simple example, right? The difference between what he expected, 100 reams of paper for $1,000, and what he actually got, 100 reams of paper for $1,200, is $200, and that's his expectation damages in this simple example. Let's look at a slightly more complicated example, and this one's about a PlayStation 5. Jason sees an ad on Craigslist for a new PlayStation 5 for $500, pickup only. He contacts the offerer, Olivia, who agrees to sell it to Jason. Jason lives in the city and he doesn't have a car, and Olivia lives in the suburbs, so Jason rents a car for $50 and drives it to Olivia's address. When he arrives, Olivia tells Jason that she actually sold the PlayStation already to someone else for more money, so it's not available to sell to Jason. Later, Jason buys another PS5 on eBay, but he pays $700 this time. Now what are his expectation damages? So we have a slightly more complex situation because effectively Jason has already paid some of the cost of this PlayStation. Part of his expected cost in getting the PlayStation was the amount he'd expend to actually go and pick it up. Similarly, if you purchase something online and you expect to pay shipping to have it delivered to your address, that is part of the cost of the item. So we have to factor that into our equation as well. And once again, the equation is the cost of substitute performance minus the price that is still unpaid equals the damages, and that whole amount of damages is meant to make the person at the status they would have been if the contract were performed. So if we plug in the numbers here, we have $700 for the substitute performance. That's how much he actually paid in reality for this PlayStation 5. He was going to pay $500. So the delta there is $200, and the expectation damages will be $200. But it's worth noting that that $50 is a price that was already paid. It is part of what he expected to pay. Jason really expected, if you think of it in the perspective of the value of the PlayStation versus what he actually paid, he expected to be $150 better off because of this deal with Olivia. Remember, the PlayStation was $500, but he expected to spend $50 in getting it, making the cost of the PlayStation effectively $550, the item plus the shipping or pickup. And therefore, the expected profit was only $150 in this case. But the expectation damages, the amount to put him in the position he would have been, needs to be $200 because that $50 has been spent. It's gone already. And so to give him the value of $150 profit in this case, the court has to award $200 so that even with his $50 cost, he is still $150 better off, which is after all what he expected and bargained for. Let's look at a third example that is one level more complex. Herbert, the homeowner, hires Patty, the painter, to paint his 5-room house for $500, with half of the payment due at the start of work and the other half due upon completion. On Monday, Herbert pays Patty $250, half of the payment, and she starts work and completes 1 room. But she doesn't show up on Tuesday, and on Wednesday she calls and says she took another job and she's not planning to come back to Herbert's house. Herbert then covers. He finds someone else to finish the work. He hires Paul the painter, who finishes all the work for $500. Then Herbert sues Patty for breach. Now what are the expectation damages? So this is a little bit different because now Patty has partially performed. In the previous examples, the seller hadn't actually performed the obligation. Here, Patty has done some of the work. So let's plug into our formula. We're going to look at, on the left side, the cost of substitute performance minus the price unpaid, the cost avoided. And that is going to be equal, as we saw when we derived the formula, to the price paid plus the expected profit minus the value of the completed performance. So how does that shake out here? Well, the substitute performance, the cost that it will cost Herbert to hire Paul to complete the work, to finish the job, is $500 additional. However, remember, Herbert only paid Patty half, and he's not going to pay the other half, so he avoided a cost of $250. And so that's the price unpaid. And those two together will actually get Herbert to his level that he expected. But let's continue. How much did Herbert actually pay? He paid $250. And how much work, how much value did Patty do? She did 1/5 of $500 worth of work, or essentially $100 worth of performance. And so we can actually calculate that Herbert expected to profit $100 from Patty's work in this case based on our formula, but that's not the amount of damages awarded. In order to give Herbert the amount of damages that will make him whole, we have to give him $250. Why is that? That's because Herbert, first and foremost, has already paid Patty $250, and second, he has to pay more for Paul to finish the job. He only avoided $250 of cost. And what does Herbert expect? He expects his whole house to be painted for a total of $500. That was the bargain. 5 rooms for $500. How do we make it so that Herbert actually pays that amount of money? How does he get what he expected? Well, after paying Patty and paying Paul, Herbert is now out a total of $750. And so in order to make Herbert in the position he would have been in had the contract been performed as expected, we need to repay him. Patty has to pay him $250, so $750 minus $250 is $500, and now Herbert has his whole house painted for $500, which is what he expected. Hence the term expectation damages. This video explained how to calculate direct damages, which is a component of expectation damages, using the most common method, the loss in value method. There are other methods to calculate direct damages, and we'll discuss that in other videos. But this video was focused on this essential element of calculating the direct damages, and we used a formula to understand the principles, where that number comes from, but in fact it's relatively straightforward. We're going to look at the cost of substitute performance minus the cost avoided, and that will result in the loss in value. Conceptually, we think of it as what's the difference between what the party received under the contract and what they expected to receive, and that difference is the loss in value. In addition to loss in value as a measure of direct damages, we also need to incorporate incidental and consequential, collectively known as indirect damages, into our total measure of expectation damages. But that's for another time. Hopefully this has been helpful in teaching you how to calculate loss in value direct damages.